Hi, welcome to the start of my vlog for my week of research for the World Cinema Dossier project. My project will be focusing on the effects on Spanish cinema of the Spanish Civil War that took place in the late 1930s. Specifically, I'm going to be looking through the lens of two of Guillermo del Toro's films, Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone. These were two magical realism films that he released in the early 2000s, so I want to look at the effects of the Spanish Civil War on Spanish cinema as a whole, specifically how he adapted these two films that took place during that time. I want to look especially at the use of magical realism and why that has become a common tool for examining that time period, as well as the use of child protagonists and the authoritarian antagonists in both of the films. I plan to, in terms of how I'm going to spend my time, first of all, I want to do a little bit of research just at a base level into the Spanish Civil War. I know the basics of what happened, but I want a little bit of a more concrete lens to look things through, so that when I'm going and watching these two films, I'll have some cultural context to go with them. After that, I'm going to watch both The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth. I've seen Pan's Labyrinth once, quite a while ago, but The Devil's Backbone is new, so I'm excited to see both of those. I'm sure they're going to be great films. After that, I just want to look at trends of Spanish cinema in general, in a sense, what Spanish cinema looked like before the war, and then how it was affected by it, and then kind of what lasting impacts were seen from it going throughout kind of Spanish history. And then once I look at kind of a more historical context, I want to look specifically at the early 2000s time period and see if Guillermo del Toro's films were the only ones to kind of adapt that time period, if there are any others, and just see what other, these are two very well-known films. I'm sure that there's already some scholarship out there examining them in their relationship to the Spanish Civil War. So I want to look and see what's already out there, see what opinions I can find, and see what I can make of it all. Hello, I'm about to get started on my first bit of research for this research project. After thinking about it, I decided I'm going to switch around the order of how I start things off. I was originally going to do a little bit of background research on the Spanish Civil War in general before going into watching The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth. But upon thinking about it, I think I'm going to watch the movies first and then do research to fill in the gaps of my knowledge after the fact. I don't want to waste a ton of time researching the Spanish Civil War, which, although I do need to know about it, I want to be able to better target the research towards stuff that relates to the movies and what I'm confused about. So I'd rather watch the movies first and then go back and kind of fill in the gaps for what I'm confused about and what I want to learn more about from a pure factual sense. So instead, I'm going to be watching The Devil's Backbone first. I'm excited to see it. I, know a little bit about it from when I was deciding that it was a movie I wanted to talk about for this project. And Guillermo del Toro is a great director, so I'm excited to see it. Well, it is about 2 hours later, and I just finished The Devil's Backbone by Guillermo del Toro. It was a great movie. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't as scary as I expected. Instead, it was gonna be a horror movie. It felt a little bit more like a thriller. But, I don't know, it was cool to see a more kind of like ground level take on the Spanish Civil War. Like, it's very much focusing on kind of more bystanders. There's some small amounts of involvement with people who have been like helping different sides of the war, but it focuses much more kind of the effects of the war on the innocent bystanders, still from a child's POV. I'm excited to go back and rewatch Pan's Labyrinth now, because I've seen Pan's Labyrinth a very long time ago, so I was kind of making comparisons in my head, child protagonist, there's the child protagonist, and magical realism that kind of ties them together in similar style, but they felt very different in the execution. And so now that I kind of have this in my brain, I'm excited to go back and rewatch Pan's Labyrinth next, and see what more specific things I can nail down about it. Hi, I just finished watching my second film for the World Cinema project, which was Pan's Labyrinth. I really liked watching Pan's Labyrinth. I'd seen it before several years ago, so it was nice to be able to rewatch it, because that meant I could focus a little bit less on following along like the story and the narrative. I could focus more on like themes and comparing it to The Devil's Backbone, which is the other movie that I just watched for it. And I really appreciated being able to kind of look at them side by side. I think what stood out to me the most was kind of how the villain and antagonist, both of them, is presented, and how that reflects on kind of takeaways from the Spanish Civil War in general. Obviously, the war was terrible for the country. It affected everyone. There was obviously the militaries fighting against each other, but there's a lot of effects on like smaller scale people who were just kind of forced to observe. And I think what stood out to me the most was in Pan's Labyrinth, it was very much almost larger than life evil. It was a military captain who was trying to fight rebels. You know, it was like a much larger stakes in a sense, versus The Devil's Backbone focused more on a smaller than life antagonist who really was just greedy and wanted to, become rich, but was also just as callous and just as harmful overall to the characters in the stories as the other one. So I don't know, I thought that was a pretty cool comparison, showing kind of the different ways that people are affected by wars going on. It's not just actual soldiers who are making everything, bad. It's people who are willing to take advantage of the opportunities as well. All right, I am about to sit down for probably an hour or so of research. My plan is to go through JSTOR mostly, and I want to be focusing on learning some more about magical realism and its use in film. Less about the origin history of it, and more just about kind of how it applies specifically to the works that I'm looking at. I'm sure I'll find a lot of stuff about Pan's Labyrinth out there because it's a very popular film. Maybe some stuff about The Devil's Backbone too, but I want to see what the general thoughts of it are, specifically with relation to Spanish cinema, and see what various bits of scholarship are out there, and see what I think of it all. So I'm gonna go for at least an hour. If I'm in a groove, who knows? Maybe I'll go a little longer. We'll see. All right. Well, I just finished probably an hour and a half or so of research into magical realism. I stayed pretty much focused on that topic, I would say. I found some good sources. There was one that I really liked, especially that talked pretty exclusively about Pan's Labyrinth and the history of the film and how it used magical realism, how it was unique in the way that it used magical realism. And I'm really excited to be able to compare that a little bit to what I found about the use of it in The Devil's Backbone. The biggest thing that it talked about that I took away was what constitutes something as magical realism. It's something within the world of the cinema that we have no discernible way of identifying whether or not it's technically real or not, because it's filmed just the same way that reality is filmed. But that can still appear in a lot of different ways. In Pan's Labyrinth, there were mostly two different worlds. There was the real world and there was the fantasy world that the protagonist was kind of going in and out of. There was a doorway that she went through to a feast with a guy with the hands, eyes. But there was crossover between those two worlds, and it was tough for us to tell at times what was real, what was her imagination. Versus with The Devil's Backbone, it really did that in a different way. It was all purely set in our world, and there was a lot less crossover, most noticeably through technically two ghosts who appeared throughout the film and were haunting the story, so to speak. But they were interacted with by the characters. There was no question as to whether or not they were actually real, because they were filmed as if they were real. And so that's how we were able to kind of distinguish that it was in fact magical realism. All right, I just finished another hour and a half or so of research. I was, again, mostly using JSTOR. JSTOR was great. Very, very helpful for finding some good sources. This one, I was doing more just general research into just scholarship around the areas that I wanted to look into. I looked a lot into magical realism during my last research session, so I tried to look more into other areas. So, the other two main things I wanted to hit on with this project were the use of the child as a protagonist and the an authoritarian figure as the antagonist. I found a lot about the role of a child protagonist, specifically relating to the Spanish Civil War. There's a few good sources on that I really liked. The reason that it was used so much was because the children were able to really represent the innocence in these wars, of people who had no stake in what was going on. They were purely victims who were forced to kind of live with this tragedy. Especially with regards to the Devil's Backbone, where both the protagonist and the ghost, the use of natural realism within the film, were both children who kind of represented different sides of what was going on. The film took place right at the tail end / after the Spanish Civil War, and so it represented kind of the two sides of, the ghost who was killed tragically and was left behind and became stuck in the past and had no way forward because they died, versus the child who represented the future of what was to come, someone who was able to make it out and go on to the next thing, kind of represented more the future of the country. So I don't know, I really enjoyed that research. Bye. Well, this is the outro for my research vlog after my week of research. My project, once again, was focusing on the effects of the Spanish Civil War on Spanish cinema, specifically through two of Guillermo del Toro's films, The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, and their use of magical realism, a child protagonist, and just kind of generally figuring out the effects of the Spanish Civil War on Spanish film during that time, and just the aftershocks of it all. I'm pretty happy with how my research went. I really enjoyed watching the films, and I found some pretty cool analysis, both of them, and general thoughts on those films and kind of the time period that they were placed in. I ended up switching up my plan a little bit from when I started, but not a crazy amount. I didn't end up doing research in the stacks, and I swapped around the order of doing, I was originally going to do initial research before watching the films. I ended up doing it after to kind of fill in the gaps more. I didn't vlog everything that I did, but I think I got a decent amount. Part of that was because I found that I really enjoyed talking a little bit more in depth about what I was feeling about each source or movie after I did it, because I think this will be helpful for me to be able to look back on, and figure out what I was thinking. Because of that, I didn't vlog everything I did because it was getting a little bit too long. But overall, I think it went well. Struggled a little bit with productivity at times, but who doesn't? I found some good sources, and I think the next step for me is to really go and synthesize. I found some good information and a few different kind of angles on magical realism, child protagonists, with relation to the Spanish Civil War, and I think there's definitely enough there. The next step for me would be to really kind of take it all and figure out where I want to go next, figure out what kind of my thesis is, what my argument is, tied into something a little bit bigger, rather than just these individual kind of data points that I have now. So I'm excited to get on that next. Thanks for sticking with me.